The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. Camila's head snapped to the side, her cheek burning with a fire that spread down her neck and into her chest. She stood frozen by the stove, the wooden spoon still gripped in her trembling hand, watching as the pasta sauce bubbled and popped, completely unaware that her world had just shattered again. "You worthless piece of trash," Derek's voice cut through the silence like broken glass. "I told you dinner better be ready by 6:30. It's 6:45. Camila's dark eyes filled with tears as she touched her stinging cheek. The beautiful African-American woman who had once commanded attention wherever she walked now cowered in her own kitchen, her natural radiance dimmed by months of fear and pain. Her silk press hair, usually perfectly styled, hung limp around her shoulders, and her designer dress from happier times now seemed to hang on her smaller frame like a costume from another life. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the simmering sauce. "The traffic was bad when I came back from the grocery store, and then the pasta took longer than—" "Shut up." Derek's hand rose again and Camila instinctively ducked, protecting her face with her arms. "I don't want to hear your pathetic excuses. You had one job today. One simple job. Make dinner and have it ready on time." Derek paced the kitchen like a caged animal, his business suit wrinkled from a long day at the law firm where he worked as a junior partner. His brown hair was disheveled, and his face was red with rage that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than just a late dinner. This was about control, about power, about making sure Camila knew exactly where she stood in their marriage. "Look at this mess," he continued, gesturing wildly at the perfectly clean kitchen where only a few pots sat on the stove. "You can't even keep a simple kitchen organized. No wonder you can't hold down a job. No wonder nobody wants to be around you anymore." The words hit harder than the slap. Camila closed her eyes and tried to remember the woman she used to be. 3 years ago, she had been the head marketing coordinator at a prestigious advertising firm. She had friends who called her every weekend, a social calendar that was always full, and dreams that seemed within her reach. She had been confident, successful, and happy. Then she met Derek at a charity gala. He had been charming, attentive, and everything she thought she wanted in a husband. The courtship had been a whirlwind of expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and promises of a future together. He had proposed after only 8 months and she had said yes, convinced she had found her soulmate. The changes started small. Derek suggested she quit her job after the wedding so she could focus on being a wife and eventually a mother. He convinced her to cut ties with friends he deemed negative influences. He gradually isolated her from her family, claiming they didn't understand their relationship. By the time she realized what was happening, she was completely dependent on him, financially and emotionally trapped in a prison of his making. "Are you even listening to me?" Derek's voice brought her back to the present. He was standing directly in front of her now, his face inches from hers. She could smell the alcohol on his breath, even though he claimed he had been at work all day. "Yes," she said quickly. "I'm listening." "Good. Because I'm only going to say this once more. In this house you follow my rules. You do what I say when I say it, how I say it. You are nothing without me. You have nothing without me. And if you ever embarrass me again by serving dinner late, there will be consequences you won't like." Camila nodded, tears streaming down her face. She had learned not to argue, not to defend herself, not to do anything that might make him angrier. The bruises from their last fight had only just faded, hidden carefully under makeup and long sleeves. Derek grabbed the plate she had prepared for him and stalked out of the kitchen toward the dining room. "Clean this up and bring me a beer," he called over his shoulder. "And next time, remember that punctuality is respect. Since you clearly don't respect me, maybe you don't deserve my respect either." Alone in the kitchen, Camila finally allowed herself to breathe. She turned off the burner and moved the sauce to a back burner, her hands shaking as she tried to compose herself. In the reflection of the stainless steel refrigerator, she could see the red handprint on her cheek, already starting to swell. She opened the freezer and pulled out a bag of frozen peas, pressing it gently against her face. The cold numbed the pain but couldn't touch the deeper hurt that lived in her chest, the constant ache of knowing she was trapped with no way out. As she stood there in the kitchen that had once been her sanctuary, Camila tried to remember what hope felt like. She tried to remember what it was like to wake up in the morning without fear, to speak without measuring every word, to exist without constantly walking on eggshells. But tonight, like every night for the past 2 years, hope seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. Tonight, all she could do was survive until tomorrow and pray that tomorrow would somehow be different. She had no idea that change was already on its way, traveling down the highway in a military convoy, carried by three men who would soon turn her world upside down in the best possible way. Camila moved through the dining room like a ghost, setting Derek's beer down beside his plate with the careful precision of someone who had learned that even the smallest mistake could trigger an explosion. Derek didn't look up from his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be work emails while mechanically eating the dinner she had prepared. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. Once upon a time, dinner had been their favorite time together. They would share stories about their days, plan weekend adventures, and laugh until their sides hurt. Now, the only sounds were the clink of Derek's fork against his plate and the distant hum of the air conditioning. Camila retreated to the kitchen and began cleaning up, moving with practiced efficiency. Every motion was calculated to minimize noise. She had learned that even the sound of dishes clinking together too loudly could set Derek off on another tirade about her carelessness and stupidity. As she washed the pots, her mind drifted to her sister Rachel, who lived 3 states away. They used to talk every day, sharing everything from work gossip to relationship advice. Rachel had been her maid of honor, the one person who had expressed quiet concerns about Derek's controlling behavior during their engagement. "I just think he's a little intense," Rachel had said the night before the wedding. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Camila had laughed off her sister's concerns then, convinced that Derek's protectiveness was a sign of how much he loved her. She had been so wrong, but by the time she realized it, Derek had convinced her to change her phone number, claiming her family was too demanding of her time. Now she hadn't spoken to Rachel in over a year. She had no idea if her sister was still working at the hospital, if she had started dating that doctor she had mentioned, or if she even thought about Camila anymore. Derek had made sure that all of her old relationships withered and died, leaving her completely dependent on him for human connection. The bag of frozen peas had warmed against her cheek, so she returned it to the freezer and examined her reflection in the microwave door. The swelling was getting worse, and she knew that by morning she would have a bruise that would take careful makeup application to hide. She had become an expert at concealing Derek's handiwork. Foundation that was 2 shades too dark for her natural skin tone to cover fingerprint bruises on her arms. Long sleeves in summer to hide marks on her wrists. Scarves to cover the time he had grabbed her throat during an argument about her spending too much time reading instead of cleaning. The worst part wasn't the physical pain though. It was the way Derek had slowly erased the person she used to be. The confident woman who had once given presentations to rooms full of executives had been replaced by someone who apologized for breathing too loudly. The social butterfly who had organized charity events and dinner parties now spent her days alone in the house, too embarrassed to go out in public and risk running into someone who might ask questions about her bruises. "Camila." Derek's voice boomed from the dining room. "Where's dessert?" Her heart sank. She had forgotten about dessert in the chaos of trying to get dinner ready on time. There was ice cream in the freezer, but Derek had very specific expectations about how his meals should be presented. Ice cream served straight from the container would be seen as lazy and disrespectful. "Coming," she called back, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. She quickly pulled out the vanilla ice cream and scooped it into a bowl, then drizzled chocolate sauce over the top in what she hoped was an attractive pattern. Her hands were shaking again, making the sauce wobble unevenly across the ice cream. When she carried the bowl into the dining room, Derek looked up at her with disgust. "This looks like something a child would make," he said, pushing the bowl away. "I work hard all day to provide for us, and this is the effort you put into taking care of me?" "I can make something else," Camila offered quickly. "I think we have some cake mix in the pantry." "I could." "Forget it." Derek stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "I'm going to my office to finish some work. Maybe by the time I'm done, you'll have figured out how to be a proper wife." He left the dining room without another word, leaving Camila standing there with the rejected dessert in her hands. She heard his office door slam shut, followed by the sound of his computer starting up. She knew he would be in there for hours, probably drinking the expensive whiskey he kept hidden in his desk drawer and playing online poker instead of working. Camila returned to the kitchen and sat down at the small breakfast table where she used to eat her morning coffee and read the news. Now she rarely bothered with the news. The outside world felt so far away from her current reality that it might as well have been fiction. She picked up her phone, a basic model that Derek had insisted on after claiming her smartphone was too expensive to maintain. The contact list was almost empty now. Derek's number, the grocery store, her doctor, and a few other essential services. All the friends who had once filled her life with laughter and support had been slowly deleted, one by one, as Derek convinced her they were jealous of their happiness or were bad influences on their marriage. Sometimes, late at night when Derek was asleep, She would lie in bed and try to remember her friends' phone numbers. Sarah from her old job, who used to take her out for drinks every Friday. Michelle from her yoga class, who had become like a sister to her during their weekend hiking adventures. Even her college roommate Jessica, who had flown in for her wedding and who had sent Christmas cards for the first year of her marriage before giving up when Camila never responded. But remembering their numbers was useless. Even if she could call them, what would she say? How could she explain that the confident, successful woman they had known had become this scared, isolated shell of a person? How could she admit that she had allowed someone to take away everything that had made her who she was? The sound of Derek's voice drifted from his office, loud and animated as he talked to someone on the phone. Probably one of his poker buddies, making plans for another boys' night out that would leave her alone in the house until the early hours of the morning, wondering if he was coming home at all. Camila touched her cheek again, feeling the heat radiating from the swollen skin. Tomorrow she would apply concealer with expert precision and venture out to the grocery store, keeping her head down and avoiding eye contact with anyone who might notice her injuries. She would buy ingredients for meals that Derek might or might not approve of, trying to anticipate his moods and preferences with the desperation of someone whose safety depended on reading invisible signs. But tonight, she would go to bed early, taking 2 of the pain relievers she kept hidden in her makeup bag, and try to fall asleep before Derek decided he wanted to continue their earlier conversation. Sleep was her only escape now, the only time when she could dream about the life she used to have and the woman she used to be. As she turned off the kitchen lights and headed upstairs, Camila had no way of knowing that 300 miles away, a military convoy was making its way through the night, carrying the only people who might be able to save her from the prison her marriage had become. The next morning arrived with the sound of Derek's alarm at precisely 6 a.m., followed by his usual routine of showering, shaving, and criticizing everything from the temperature of his coffee to the way Camila had ironed his shirts. By 7:30 he was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his expensive cologne and a list of tasks he expected completed before he returned home. Camila stood at the kitchen window, watching Derek's black BMW disappear down their suburban street. The morning sun cast long shadows across their perfectly manicured lawn, a lawn that Derek paid a service to maintain because he claimed Camila couldn't be trusted with anything important. She touched her cheek gingerly. The swelling had gone down slightly overnight, but the bruise was now a deep purple that would require careful makeup application if she needed to go anywhere public. She had become an expert at color correction, layering different shades of concealer to hide the evidence of Derek's anger. The house felt enormous and empty with Derek gone. It was a beautiful house, she had to admit. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen, and a backyard that looked like something from a home improvement magazine. Derek had chosen it without consulting her, presenting it as a surprise gift after their honeymoon. At the time, she had been touched by his thoughtfulness. Now, she understood it was just another way to control her, trapping her in a suburban paradise that felt more like an elegant prison. Camila made herself a cup of tea and sat at the breakfast table with Derek's list. Dry cleaning pickup, grocery shopping for a dinner party he was hosting for some colleagues next week, calling the landscaping service about the sprinkler system, organizing his office files. None of the tasks were particularly difficult, but they would fill her entire day, leaving no time for anything that might bring her joy or fulfillment. She had just started making notes about the dinner party menu when she heard the rumble of large vehicles outside. Through the front window she could see 2 military trucks pulling into their driveway, their olive green paint and official markings stark against the pristine suburban landscape. Camila's heart began to race. Had something happened to Derek? Was there some kind of emergency? She quickly checked her appearance in the hallway mirror, making sure her bruise was adequately covered, and opened the front door just as 3 men in military uniforms climbed out of the trucks. The man in the lead was tall and broad-shouldered, with the same dark hair and strong jawline as Derek, but where Derek's face had grown hard and cruel over the years, this man's expression was kind and open. Behind him walked 2 other soldiers, both African-American men who carried themselves with the confident bearing of people who had seen the world and understood their place in it. "Ma'am," the first man said, removing his cap as he approached the door. "I'm Staff Sergeant James Hamilton. I believe I'm Derek's brother. These are my colleagues, Sergeant Michael Johnson and Corporal Kevin Washington. We were hoping Derek might be home." Camila's mouth fell open. James. Derek's younger brother, who had been deployed overseas for the past 3 years. Derek rarely talked about his family, and when he did, it was usually to criticize them for not understanding his success or appreciating how far he had come from their working-class background. "He's at work," she managed to say, suddenly conscious of how she must look to these men who knew Derek from before he became the person he was now. "I'm Camila, his wife. He's mentioned you, of course, but I didn't know you were coming to visit." James smiled, and the resemblance to Derek was striking, but there was warmth in his eyes that Derek's had lost years ago. "We just got back stateside yesterday. Thought we'd surprise him. We have a few days of leave before we report to our new assignment." "Please come in," Camila said, stepping back to let them enter. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be great, ma'am," Sergeant Johnson said. His voice was deep and gentle, and when he smiled, Camila noticed that his eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that suggested he smiled often. "It's been a long drive from Fort Bragg." As they settled in the living room, Camila busied herself in the kitchen, grateful for something to do with her hands. She could hear the men talking quietly among themselves, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of people who had been through difficult experiences together. "Your home is beautiful," Corporal Washington said when she returned with a tray of coffee and the pastries she had been saving for Derek's breakfast. "You must be very proud of what you and Derek have built together." The innocent comment hit Camila like a physical blow. What they had built together. If only he knew that she had built nothing, that every decision from the color of the walls to the furniture arrangement had been Derek's choice, usually made without consulting her or after dismissing her opinions as irrelevant. "Thank you," she said quietly, taking a seat in the chair farthest from the men. It was a habit now, always positioning herself near an exit, always maintaining distance in case she needed to escape quickly. James studied her with the sharp eyes of someone trained to notice details. His gaze lingered on her face, and she wondered if her makeup was as effective as she had hoped. Military men were probably trained to spot injuries, to notice when something wasn't right. "So what does Derek do for work now?" James asked. "Last I heard, he had just started at some law firm." "He's a junior partner now," Camila said, repeating the words Derek used to describe his position. "He works very hard. Long hours. He's very dedicated to his career." "And what about you?" Sergeant Johnson asked. "What do you do?" The question was innocent enough, but it sent a wave of shame through Camila that was almost overwhelming. What did she do? She existed. She survived. She tried to anticipate Derek's needs and moods well enough to avoid his anger. She had once been someone with ambitions and talents and dreams, but that person felt like a stranger now. "I take care of the house," she said finally. "Make sure everything runs smoothly for Derek." The three men exchanged glances that didn't go unnoticed by Camila. There was something in their expressions, a flicker of concern or confusion that made her wonder what Derek had told them about his life, about their marriage. "That's important work too," Corporal Washington said kindly. "Keeping a home running smoothly is no small task." Before Camila could respond, they all heard the sound of Derek's car in the driveway. Her entire body tensed automatically, the way it always did when she heard that particular engine sound. Derek was home early, which usually meant something had gone wrong at work, which usually meant he would be looking for someone to blame. "That must be him now," James said, standing up as the front door opened. Derek's voice boomed through the house before he even made it to the living room. "Camila, whose trucks are in our driveway? If you invited someone over without asking me first, I swear to God." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw the three uniformed men standing in his living room. For just a moment, his face showed genuine surprise and what might have been pleasure at seeing his brother. But then his expression hardened, and Camila saw the calculating look that always appeared when Derek was trying to figure out how to control a situation. "James," he said, his voice carefully modulated now. "What a surprise. What brings you to my home?" The words, "my home," were emphasized just enough to make it clear that Derek saw this as his territory, his domain where he made the rules. Camila had heard that tone before, usually right before Derek launched into a lecture about respect and boundaries and knowing one's place. "Just wanted to see my big brother," James said easily, seemingly unaware of the tension that had suddenly filled the room. "And meet the wife you've been hiding from us." Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Camila knew that look, knew that something about this unexpected visit was already irritating him. The fact that she had let the men into the house without his permission, the fact that they had seen her before he could prepare them for what they should think about his marriage, the fact that his carefully controlled world had been disrupted by people he couldn't intimidate or manipulate. This was going to be a very interesting visit. Derek moved into the living room with the calculated stride of a man reclaiming his territory. He had changed subtly in the presence of his brother and the other soldiers, his posture straighter, his voice deeper, as if he were trying to project an authority that didn't come naturally to him in this context. You should have called first, Derek said, not bothering to hide his irritation. I have a very busy schedule. Important clients depend on me. James raised an eyebrow, and Camila caught the brief look of surprise that crossed his face. Sorry about that, brother. We just finished a long deployment and wanted to see family. Didn't realize we needed an appointment. The gentle rebuke hung in the air, and Derek's face flushed slightly. Camila recognized the signs of his building anger, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the tight set of his jaw when he felt his authority was being questioned. Of course you don't need an appointment, Derek said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm just surprised, that's all. Camila should have called me at work to let me know we had guests. All three soldiers turned to look at Camila, who felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She should have called Derek, but the thought honestly hadn't occurred to her. She had been so shocked by the unexpected visitors and so focused on being a good hostess that she had forgotten about Derek's rule that all social interactions had to be pre-approved by him. That's my fault, James said quickly. I told her not to bother you at work. We figured we'd just wait until you got home. Derek's smile became even more strained. Well, you're here now. Can I get you gentlemen something stronger than coffee? I have some excellent whiskey in my office. Coffee's fine for us, Sergeant Johnson said. We don't drink during the day. Of course not, Derek said, though something in his tone suggested he found their discipline unreasonable. Professional soldiers. Always on duty. Camila excused herself to refresh the coffee pot, grateful for an excuse to leave the room. In the kitchen, she could hear the conversation continuing, Derek's voice growing louder and more animated as he tried to impress his brother with stories of his legal victories and business success. Closed a deal last week that netted the firm over $2 million, Derek was saying. The client specifically requested me because of my reputation for getting results. That's great, Derek, James replied, but Camila could hear the forced enthusiasm in his voice. You always were ambitious. Ambitious and smart enough to recognize opportunities, Derek continued. Not everyone has what it takes to succeed in the corporate world. It requires a certain kind of discipline and focus that most people just don't possess. When Camila returned with fresh coffee, she found Derek in full performance mode, gesturing expansively as he described his latest case. The three soldiers were listening politely, but she could see the subtle signs of their discomfort. The way Corporal Washington's eyes kept drifting to her face, as if he were trying to get a better look at something. The way Sergeant Johnson leaned back slightly in his chair, creating distance. The way James's expression had grown more guarded as Derek talked. And of course, Derek was saying, having the right support system at home makes all the difference. Camila keeps everything running perfectly so I can focus on my career. Don't you, sweetheart? The endearment sounded false and patronizing, and Camila felt all four men's attention focus on her. I try to help however I can, she said quietly. She's very good at taking care of the house, Derek continued, his tone suggesting he was praising a particularly well-trained pet. Keeps everything organized, meals on time, never complains about the long hours I have to work. A man needs a wife who understands priorities. James's expression had grown distinctly cooler. I'm sure marriage is about partnership and mutual support, he said carefully. Derek laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. That's a nice ideal, James, but the reality is that someone has to lead and someone has to follow. In successful relationships, the roles are clearly defined. Camila understands that my career comes first because it provides for both of us. What did you do before you got married, Camila? Corporal Washington asked, ignoring Derek's lecture entirely and directing his question straight to her. Derek answered before she could open her mouth. She had a little marketing job at some local company. Nothing serious. She's much better suited to domestic life anyway. I was head of marketing coordination at Patterson and Associates, Camila said quietly, surprising herself with her boldness. I managed campaigns for several major clients. The three soldiers looked at her with new interest and Derek's face darkened. It wasn't really a management position, he said quickly. More of an assistant role. Camila tends to exaggerate her responsibilities. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. James looked back and forth between his brother and sister-in-law, and Camila could see understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. Sergeant Johnson and Corporal Washington had both straightened in their chairs, their military training apparently alerting them to conflict even in civilian settings. Well, James said finally, I'd love to hear more about your marketing experience, Camila. That sounds like challenging work. It was, Camila said, her voice gaining strength. I really enjoyed the creative aspects and the client relationships. We worked with everyone from small local businesses to national corporations. Fascinating, Derek said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But I think our guests are probably more interested in hearing about current events, not ancient history. Camila, why don't you start thinking about lunch? I'm sure these men are hungry after their long drive. It was a clear dismissal, Derek's way of removing her from a conversation he couldn't control. But instead of immediately jumping up to obey as she usually would, Camila found herself looking at James, who was watching the interaction with sharp, intelligent eyes. Actually, James said, I'd like to hear more about what both of you are doing now. Derek, you mentioned working long hours. That must be hard on your marriage. Derek's laugh was harsh. Marriage requires sacrifice, James. Camila understands that my success benefits both of us. Not everyone is cut out for the corporate world, but everyone can contribute in their own way. And what ways do you contribute to the partnership, Derek? Sergeant Johnson asked, his voice deceptively casual. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Derek's face grew red, and Camila recognized the warning signs of an explosion building. When Derek felt cornered or questioned, especially by people he considered his equals or superiors, his anger became unpredictable and dangerous. I provide everything, Derek said, his voice rising. This house, the cars, the lifestyle, the financial security. I work 60 hours a week to make sure we have everything we need. And Camila provides emotional support, household management, social coordination, James said quietly. Sounds like she works pretty hard too. It's not the same thing, Derek snapped. Anyone can clean a house or cook a meal. Not everyone can handle the pressure and responsibility of my job. The dismissive comment about Camila's contributions was too much for the three soldiers, who had clearly been raised with different values about respect and partnership. Camila could see the change in their faces, the way their expressions hardened as they began to understand exactly what kind of man Derek had become. Actually, Corporal Washington said, his voice carefully controlled, maintaining a home and supporting a partner's career is skilled work that deserves respect. Derek's face twisted with anger, and for a moment, Camila thought he might actually lose his temper in front of his brother and friends. Instead, he took a deep breath and forced another fake smile. Of course, he said. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. Camila knows how much I appreciate everything she does. But the damage was done. The three soldiers had heard enough to understand the dynamic in this house, and their opinion of Derek was written clearly on their faces. The visit that Derek had probably hoped would impress his military brother with his success and sophistication had instead revealed the ugly truth about who he had become. And Camila, for the first time in 2 years, didn't feel completely alone. The tension in the living room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek had excused himself to use the bathroom, leaving Camila alone with the three soldiers, and she could feel their eyes on her as she nervously straightened already perfect cushions and rearranged magazines that didn't need arranging. Camila, James said gently, waiting until she looked up at him. Can I ask you something? She nodded, though her heart was racing. Derek would be back any minute, and if he caught her having a private conversation with his brother, there would be consequences later. How did you get that bruise on your face? The question was asked so quietly, so matter-of-factly, that for a moment Camila didn't understand what he had said. Then the blood drained from her face as she realized her makeup hadn't been as effective as she had hoped. I don't know what you mean, she said automatically, her hand flying up to touch her cheek. Ma'am, Sergeant Johnson said, leaning forward slightly, we've all had training in recognizing signs of domestic violence. That's a fresh bruise, and the pattern suggests it was made by someone's hand. Camila felt trapped, cornered between her fear of Derek and these three men who were looking at her with concern and growing anger. I fell, she said, the lie sounding weak even to her own ears. Yesterday morning. I slipped in the bathroom and hit my face on the counter. The three men exchanged looks that clearly communicated their disbelief. Corporal Washington shook his head slowly, his expression sad but unsurprised. We've heard a lot of excuses over the years, he said quietly. Falls, accidents, clumsiness. But we know what a handprint looks like when we see one. Please, Camila whispered, glancing toward the hallway where Derek had disappeared. Don't say anything to him. It will only make things worse. The admission hung in the air like a confession. She had essentially confirmed their suspicions without meaning to, revealing that there were indeed things that could be made worse, that Derek was capable of behavior that would require intervention. James's face had gone very still, the kind of controlled calm that military personnel developed when dealing with dangerous situations. How long has this been going on? It's not what you think, Camila said desperately. Derek works very hard. He's under a lot of stress. Sometimes he just gets frustrated and I don't always handle things the right way. There is no right way to handle someone hitting you, Sergeant Johnson said firmly. There is no excuse, no reason, no justification for a man to put his hands on his wife in anger. The sound of Derek's footsteps in the hallway made Camila panic. Please, she begged quietly. Don't say anything. I can handle this. It's not as bad as it looks. But it was too late. Derek appeared in the doorway and immediately sensed the changed atmosphere in the room. His eyes darted between his brother and Camila, noting her obvious distress and the soldier's grim expressions. What's going on here? He asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. We were just getting to know your wife better, James said, his tone carefully neutral. She was telling us about her marketing background. Derek's eyes narrowed as he studied the scene. Camila knew he was trying to figure out what had been said in his absence, whether his carefully constructed facade had been damaged by something she had revealed. Camila can be quite the storyteller, Derek said, moving to stand behind her chair in what appeared to be an affectionate gesture but felt more like a claim of ownership. His hand settled on her shoulder, and she flinched involuntarily at his touch. The flinch was noticed by all three soldiers, who were trained to observe human behavior under stress. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Corporal Washington's hands clenched into fists before he forced them to relax. Derek, James said, his voice. Retry. Sissy. Continue. Edit. Taking on a harder edge. Can we talk privately for a minute? Maybe in your office. Derek's hand tightened on Camila's shoulder, his fingers digging in just hard enough to send a message. Anything you want to say to me you can say in front of my wife. We don't keep secrets from each other. The irony of the statement was lost on Derek but not on anyone else in the room. James stood up slowly, his military bearing making him appear larger and more imposing than he had seemed while sitting down. Actually, brother, I think this conversation needs to happen between men. Sergeant Johnson, Corporal Washington, would you mind keeping Camila company while Derek and I have a quick chat? It wasn't really a request. There was something in James's tone that suggested military command, the voice of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed. Derek hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being separated from Camila when he couldn't control what she might say, but unable to refuse without seeming weak in front of the other soldiers. Fine, Derek said, removing his hand from Camila's shoulder. But make it quick. I have calls to return. As the two brothers left for Derek's office, Sergeant Johnson moved to sit closer to Camila, while Corporal Washington positioned himself where he could see both the hallway and the front door. Their movements were subtle but strategic, the unconscious positioning of people trained in security and protection. Ma'am, Sergeant Johnson said quietly, whatever happens in the next few minutes, I want you to know that you're safe right now. We're not going to let anyone hurt you. From Derek's office came the sound of raised voices, though the words were muffled by the closed door. Camila could hear Derek's voice rising in anger and James's deeper tones responding with what sounded like controlled fury. He's going to be so angry with me, Camila whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. You don't understand. When people interfere when he thinks I've been talking about our private business, he gets... He gets what? Corporal Washington asked gently. Worse, she finished, her voice barely audible. The voices from the office grew louder, and suddenly there was a crash as if something heavy had been thrown against the wall. Sergeant Johnson was on his feet immediately, moving toward the hallway, but Corporal Washington stopped him with a gesture. Let James handle it, he said quietly. He knows what he's doing. In the office, James's voice could be heard clearly now, no longer muffled by distance or diplomacy. You're going to sit down, shut up, and listen to what I have to say, Derek. And if you ever raise your hand to another human being again, especially your wife, you're going to have to answer to me. How dare you come into my house and threaten me? Derek's voice was shrill with rage. This is none of your business. What happens between me and my wife is private. Nothing is private when it involves violence, James shot back. Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I can't see what you've done to her? She flinches when you touch her, Derek. She's terrified of you. She respects me. Derek screamed. Something you obviously never learned. I provide for her, I take care of her, I give her everything she needs. You've isolated her, controlled her, and beaten her into submission. James's voice was ice cold now. That's not marriage, Derek. That's imprisonment. The office door slammed open and Derek stormed out, his face purple with rage. Behind him, James followed more slowly, his expression grim but controlled. Derek looked at Camila with such fury that she instinctively shrank back in her chair. What did you tell them? he demanded, advancing toward her. What lies did you spread about me while I was gone? Sergeant Johnson stepped between Derek and Camila so smoothly it seemed choreographed. Step back, he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. Get out of my way, Derek snarled. This is my house and that's my wife and I'll speak to her however I want. No, Corporal Washington said, rising from his chair. You won't. For the first time since she had known him, Camila saw Derek face opposition he couldn't intimidate or manipulate. These three men had been trained to handle dangerous situations, had faced real combat, real threats. Derek's bluster and rage meant nothing to them. You need to calm down, James said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. You need to sit down and you need to think very carefully about what happens next. Are you threatening me in my own home? Derek's voice was rising toward hysteria. I'll call the police. I'll have you all arrested. For what? Sergeant Johnson asked calmly. Visiting family? Having a conversation? We haven't touched you, Derek. We haven't threatened you. We've simply made it clear that we won't stand by and watch you abuse your wife. The word, abuse, hit Derek like a physical blow. I don't abuse anyone. I've never abused anyone. Camila, tell them. Tell them what our marriage is really like. All eyes turned to Camila, who sat frozen in her chair, trapped between her terror of Derek's future retaliation and the hope she saw in these three men's faces. For 2 years she had dreamed of someone, anyone, seeing through Derek's facade and offering her help. Now that moment had arrived, and she was paralyzed by the fear of what would happen when these soldiers left and she was alone with Derek again. She started, then stopped, her voice failing her. It's okay, James said gently, kneeling down beside her chair so he was at her eye level. You don't have to say anything right now, but I need you to know that you have options. You have choices. And you have people who will help you make those choices if you want them to. Derek's face contorted with rage at seeing his brother comforting his wife, at witnessing his carefully maintained control slipping away in front of witnesses he couldn't silence or intimidate. Get out, he said, his voice shaking with fury. All of you. Get out of my house right now. We'll leave, James said, standing up slowly. But we'll be back. And Camila, if you need anything at all, you call this number. He pressed a business card into her palm. Day or night. We won't abandon you. As the three soldiers gathered their things and headed for the door, Derek stood rigid with rage, watching his world crumble around him. For the first time in years, someone had challenged his authority, questioned his behavior, and offered his wife an alternative to the prison he had built around her. The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving Camila alone with Derek and the terrible silence that followed the storm. She clutched James's business card in her trembling hand, knowing that everything had just changed for better or worse. Derek turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw a fury that promised consequences she had never imagined. The silence that followed the soldier's departure was more terrifying than Derek's loudest screaming fit. He stood motionless in the center of the living room, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, his eyes fixed on Camila with an intensity that made her feel like prey being studied by a predator. She remained frozen in her chair, James's business card clutched so tightly in her palm that the edges were cutting into her skin. The small piece of cardstock felt like both a lifeline and a death sentence, tangible proof of her betrayal in Derek's eyes. Stand up, Derek said finally, his voice unnaturally calm. Camila's legs trembled as she rose from the chair, her movements slow and careful. She had learned to read Derek's moods like a survival manual, and this eerie calm was more dangerous than his explosive anger. When he yelled and screamed, his rage burned hot and fast. This cold fury could last for days. Show me what he gave you, Derek said, extending his hand. For a moment, Camila considered lying, pretending she didn't know what he meant. But Derek had been watching her every move for the past 2 years. He knew her tells, her habits, her fears. There was no point in pretending. With shaking fingers, she opened her palm and revealed the business card. Derek plucked it from her hand and studied it, his jaw working as he read James's contact information. Staff Sergeant James Hamilton. He read aloud, his voice dripping with mockery. How heroic. How noble. My little brother, riding to the rescue like some kind of white knight. He looked up at Camila, and she saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was calculation, the look of someone planning something terrible. Did you tell him about our private moments? Derek asked, stepping closer. Did you share intimate details of our marriage with strangers? No, Camila whispered. I didn't say anything. They noticed. They noticed what, exactly? Camilla's hand flew automatically to her cheek, and Derek's smile was sharp and predatory. Ah yes, your clumsiness. Your tendency to walk into doors and fall downstairs. Such an unfortunate habit. The sarcasm in his voice made it clear that he knew exactly what his brother and friends had suspected, and he didn't care. If anything, he seemed almost proud that his control over her was so obvious. I think, Derek said, beginning to pace around her in a slow circle, that you've forgotten something very important about our relationship. You've forgotten who you are and who I am. Camilla kept her eyes fixed on the floor, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. This was the Derek she feared most, the one who spoke in quiet, reasonable tones while planning her punishment. You are nothing without me, he continued, his voice hypnotically soft. You have no money of your own, no job, no friends, no family who cares enough to check on you. You are completely dependent on my generosity, my protection, my love. Each word was designed to cut, to reinforce the mental prison he had built around her brick by brick over the past 2 years. And I, Derek said, stopping directly in front of her, am the only person in this world who truly understands you. I know your weaknesses, your flaws, your tendency towards selfishness and ingratitude. I know that without guidance, without structure, you would destroy yourself. He reached out and lifted her chin, forcing her to look at him. His touch was gentle, almost loving, which made it more terrifying than if he had grabbed her roughly. Those men who were just here? They don't know you. They don't understand the complexities of our relationship. They see a few bruises and think they understand everything, but they have no idea what you're really like when no one else is around. Camilla wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. 2 years of systematic psychological abuse had worn down her ability to fight back, to assert her own reality against Derek's twisted version of events. They think they're helping you, Derek continued, his thumb stroking her cheek with mock tenderness. But what they're really doing is filling your head with dangerous ideas. Ideas about independence and self-worth that you're not equipped to handle. He released her chin and began pacing again, his energy building as he worked himself into a philosophical frenzy about the nature of their relationship. Marriage is about hierarchy, Camilla. It's about someone being strong enough to lead and someone being wise enough to follow. I tried to explain this to you gently, with patience and understanding. But you keep testing me, keep pushing boundaries, keep making me be the bad guy. The victim blaming was so familiar that Camilla almost found herself nodding along. This was Derek's greatest talent, his ability to twist reality until she questioned her own perceptions and memories. Today's little performance was the final test, Derek said, stopping in front of her again. And you failed. You sat there and let strangers form opinions about our private life. You allowed them to disrespect me in my own home. You chose their temporary sympathy over loyalty to your husband. Camilla's throat felt like it was closing up. She knew what was coming, could feel Derek building toward something that would be worse than anything that had come before. I'm disappointed in you, Derek said, shaking his head sadly. After everything I've done for you, all the patience I've shown, all the second chances I've given you, this is how you repay me. He walked to the window and looked out at the street, where the neighbors were going about their normal suburban lives, completely unaware of the psychological torture happening just a few houses away. I think, Derek said slowly, that you need some time to think about what kind of wife you want to be. What kind of person you want to be. Whether you want to be part of this family or whether you want to throw away everything we've built together. The threat was clear even though it was wrapped in the language of choice and consequence. Derek was planning something, some form of punishment that would be designed to break her spirit completely. Go to our bedroom, he said, not turning around from the window. I'll be up in a few minutes to discuss your behavior and what needs to change going forward. Camilla's legs felt like water as she climbed the stairs to their bedroom. Behind her, she could hear Derek moving around the living room, probably cleaning up any evidence of the afternoon's confrontation, erasing any trace that his brother and friends had been there. In the bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, hollow-eyed and broken, nothing like the confident person she had been just 3 years ago. From downstairs came the sound of Derek's voice on the phone, probably calling his office to cancel his afternoon appointments. When Derek decided to discuss her behavior, it usually took hours, sometimes stretching late into the night as he methodically dismantled her self-worth and rebuilt it in the shape he preferred. But this time felt different. This time there had been witnesses to his mask slipping. This time, someone had offered her help, had seen through his facade and recognized the truth of what her life had become. James's business card was gone, confiscated by Derek, but the memory of his kind eyes and his promise remained. "We won't abandon you," he had said, and something in his voice had convinced her that he meant it. For the first time in 2 years, Camila allowed herself to imagine a different future, a life where she didn't have to measure every word and action against Derek's unpredictable moods. It was a dangerous thought, one that could get her into even more trouble if Derek sensed it, but she couldn't push it away. Change was coming whether Derek liked it or not. The question was whether she would be strong enough to survive it. Derek's footsteps on the stairs were deliberate and slow, each step designed to build anticipation and fear. Camila had been sitting on their bed for 20 minutes, her mind racing through possible scenarios, each one worse than the last. When he finally appeared in the doorway, he was carrying a glass of his expensive whiskey and wearing the cold smile that meant he had been planning her punishment in detail. "I've been thinking about our conversation downstairs," Derek said, settling into the armchair by the window like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. "And I've realized that I've been too permissive with you. Too understanding. Too willing to make excuses for your behavior." Camila remained silent, having learned long ago that anything she said during these sessions would be twisted and used against her. "Today's incident with my brother proves that you can't be trusted with normal social interactions," Derek continued, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "You clearly don't understand appropriate boundaries or how to represent our marriage in a positive light." He set his glass down on the side table and looked at her with the expression of someone solving a complex problem. "So I've decided that we need to implement some new rules. Some structure that will help you learn self-discipline and proper behavior." The word rules sent a chill through Camila's body. Derek's previous rules had gradually isolated her from the outside world, stripped away her independence, and turned her into a prisoner in her own home. She couldn't imagine what new restrictions he was planning. "First," Derek said, counting on his fingers, "no more unsupervised contact with visitors. If someone comes to the door, you get me immediately. You don't invite them in, you don't have conversations, you don't make decisions about hospitality without my approval." Camila nodded automatically, though the rule was pointless since they never had visitors anyway. "Second, I think your free time is part of the problem. Idle hands and all that. So I'm going to give you more structure to your days. I'll prepare a schedule of tasks and activities that will keep you busy and focused on productive things." The idea of having every minute of her day planned and controlled by Derek made Camila feel like she was suffocating, but she kept her expression neutral. "Third," Derek continued, his voice growing more excited as he outlined his plans, "I think we need to address your tendency toward selfishness and ingratitude. So every evening before dinner, you're going to write down 3 things you're grateful for about our marriage and 3 ways you can improve as a wife." The psychological manipulation was so blatant that even in her weakened state, Camila could see it for what it was. Derek was trying to force her to gaslight herself, to convince herself that her abuse was actually evidence of his love and care. "And finally," Derek said, standing up and beginning to pace, "I think some of your problems stem from too much exposure to outside influences. Television, books, the internet, they all fill your head with unrealistic expectations and feminist nonsense about independence and equality." Camila's heart sank as she realized what was coming. "So for the next month, you'll have no access to any media or entertainment. No TV, no computer, no books except the ones I approve. You need to clear your head of outside influences and focus on what really matters, being the best wife you can be." The punishment was designed to complete her isolation, to cut off her last connections to the outside world and leave her completely dependent on Derek for information, entertainment, and human contact. It was psychological torture disguised as marriage improvement. "Do you understand these new rules?" Derek asked, stopping in front of her. "Yes," Camila whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good. We'll start implementing them tomorrow morning. I think you'll find that structure and discipline will help you feel more settled and content." Derek retrieved his whiskey glass and headed for the door, then paused and looked back at her. "Oh, and Camila? If my brother or his friends try to contact you, you're to tell me immediately. I don't want you to have any private conversations with them, understand? They don't have your best interests at heart." After Derek left, Camila remained sitting on the bed, staring at the wall and trying to process what had just happened. The new rules weren't just restrictions, they were a systematic plan to break her spirit completely, to eliminate any possibility of outside support or rescue. But something had changed in her during the afternoon's confrontation. Seeing Derek's mask slip in front of his brother, watching him lose control when faced with real opposition, had shown her that he wasn't as powerful as he wanted her to believe. He was terrified of losing control over her, which meant that control wasn't as absolute as she had thought. 3 hours later, when Derek was in his office drinking and playing online poker, Camila made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She crept downstairs and used the landline phone in the kitchen to call information. "I need the number for Fort Bragg," she whispered to the operator. "Military Personnel Directory." Her hands shook as she dialed the number and asked to be connected to Staff Sergeant James Hamilton. It took several transfers and long minutes of waiting, but finally she heard his familiar voice on the line. "James, it's Camila," she said, speaking as quietly as possible while keeping one ear tuned for any sound from Derek's office. "I need help." "Are you safe right now?" James asked immediately, his voice sharp with concern. "For now. But Derek he's implementing new rules. I think he's planning to isolate me completely. I'm scared of what he might do." "Listen to me carefully," James said, his military training kicking in as he shifted into operational mode. "We're going to get you out of there, but we need to be smart about it. Do you have somewhere you can go? Family, friends, anyone Derek doesn't know about?" Camila thought desperately. Derek had systematically eliminated all her close relationships, but there might be one person he had overlooked. "My sister Rachel," she said. "She lives in North Carolina. Derek made me cut contact with her, but I don't think he knows her address." "Perfect. Here's what we're going to do." For the next 10 minutes, James outlined a plan that sounded like something from a military operation. They would wait until Derek left for work the next morning. Then James and his friends would arrive to help her pack essential belongings and evidence of Derek's abuse. They would drive her to the bus station, where she could travel to her sister's house while they stayed behind to deal with Derek if he came home early. "What about legally?" Camila asked. "He'll try to find me. He'll say I stole his car or his money or something." "We're documenting everything," James assured her. "Photos of your injuries, recordings of our conversations, witness statements. When this goes to court, Derek won't be able to claim you're the problem." The plan was risky and complicated, but it offered something Camila hadn't had in 2 years: hope. Real, concrete hope for escape and freedom. "Can you hold on until tomorrow morning?" James asked. "Can you get through one more night?" Camila looked toward Derek's office, where she could hear him laughing at something on his computer, completely confident in his control over her and their situation. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "I can hold on." "Good. We'll be there at 8:30 tomorrow morning, exactly 30 minutes after Derek leaves for work. Be ready." After hanging up the phone, Camila crept back upstairs and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and planning her escape. For the first time in 2 years, she fell asleep without being afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow she would reclaim her life. Camila woke before Derek's alarm, her body vibrating with nervous energy and the strange sensation of hope she had almost forgotten existed. She lay still in the darkness, listening to Derek's steady breathing beside her, and tried to memorize every detail of the plan James had outlined. At exactly 6 a.m., Derek's alarm began its shrill beeping. He rolled out of bed with his usual morning grumbling, stumbled to the bathroom and began his rigid routine of shower, shave, and coffee. Camila had timed this routine hundreds of times over the past 2 years. Derek was as predictable as clockwork, which would work in her favor today. She forced herself to go through her own normal morning routine, preparing Derek's breakfast and coffee with the same careful attention she always paid to his preferences. The normalcy felt surreal, like she was acting in a play about her own life. "I have back-to-back meetings all morning," Derek said as he ate his eggs, not looking up from his phone. "Don't expect me home for lunch. And remember what we discussed yesterday about your new schedule. I expect you to start implementing the rules immediately." "Of course," Camila said quietly, refilling his coffee cup with steady hands that betrayed none of her inner turmoil. Derek left the house at exactly 8 a.m., the same time he left every morning, completely unaware that his carefully controlled world was about to implode. Camila watched his BMW disappear down the street, then ran upstairs and began the most important packing job of her life. She had thought carefully about what to take. Important documents first: her birth certificate, social security card, passport, and marriage certificate were hidden in a jewelry box Derek never bothered to open. Then clothes, but only basics that could fit in one suitcase. Everything else could be replaced, but her freedom couldn't. The most crucial items were the evidence. Photos she had secretly taken of bruises over the past year, hidden in a folder behind other pictures on her old camera. Medical records from the 2 times Derek's violence had been severe enough to require treatment, though she had lied to the doctors about the cause of her injuries. The notebook where she had started documenting Derek's threats and violent episodes, though she had been too scared to write down the worst incidents. At exactly 8:30, she heard the rumble of the military trucks in her driveway. Through the window she could see James, Sergeant Johnson, and Corporal Washington climbing out, moving with the efficient purpose of people executing a well-planned operation. Camila opened the door before they could knock, her suitcase in one hand and a bag containing the evidence in the other. "Are you ready?" James asked, his eyes scanning her face for any signs of new injuries. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of controlled activity. While Camila finished packing, the three soldiers systematically documented everything they could find that might be relevant to her case. Sergeant Johnson photographed the house, paying special attention to the expensive items Derek had used to establish his financial control. Corporal Washington took pictures of Camila's remaining bruises and helped her write a detailed statement about the pattern of abuse. James focused on gathering financial documents and evidence of Derek's control tactics. "We need to establish a paper trail," he explained as he photographed Derek's home office. "Bank statements, credit card bills, anything that shows how he controlled your access to money." The evidence was overwhelming. Derek's computer, which he had left unlocked in his arrogance, contained emails to her former employer claiming she was having a nervous breakdown and shouldn't be contacted. There were credit reports he had pulled without her knowledge, tracking her financial activity. Most damning of all, there was a folder of research about managing difficult wives and maintaining authority in marriage. "This is enough to establish a pattern of psychological abuse," James said grimly as he photographed the computer screen. "No court is going to believe this was a normal marriage." By 9:15 they were ready to leave. Camila took one last look around the house that had been her prison for 2 years, trying to feel some sense of nostalgia or loss. Instead, all she felt was relief and a growing sense of excitement about the future. The drive to the bus station took 20 minutes, during which James explained what would happen next. "You'll stay with your sister until the legal proceedings are finished," he said. "We've already contacted a lawyer who specializes in domestic violence cases. She'll handle the divorce paperwork and make sure Derek can't use the legal system to harass you." "What about Derek?" Camila asked. "What happens when he gets home and finds me gone?" "We'll be there," Corporal Washington said from the driver's seat. "We're going to have a conversation with him about appropriate behavior and legal consequences. Make sure he understands that any attempt to contact you or your family will result in criminal charges." At the bus station, James handed Camila an envelope containing enough cash for her ticket and expenses for the next few weeks. "This is from all of us," he said. "Consider it an investment in your future." As Camila boarded the bus that would take her to her sister's house and her new life, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, pride in herself. She had found the courage to ask for help, to accept help, and to take the terrifying step of leaving everything familiar behind in pursuit of something better. The bus pulled away from the station, carrying her toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Through the window, she could see James and his friends waiting to make sure she departed safely, 3 guardian angels who had appeared in her life at exactly the right moment. For the first time in 2 years, Camila smiled a real smile, not the careful, measured expression she had learned to wear around Derek, but a genuine expression of joy and anticipation. She was free, truly free, and the whole world was waiting for her to rediscover who she could become. 6 hours later, she was in her sister's arms, crying tears of relief and gratitude as Rachel held her and whispered, "I never stopped hoping you'd come home." 6 months later, Camila stood in front of the bathroom mirror in Rachel's guest bedroom, applying makeup not to hide bruises but simply because she wanted to look nice for her job interview. The face looking back at her was still her own, but it was a face transformed by freedom, proper nutrition, and the slow healing that came from safety and love. The physical changes were obvious. She had gained back the 20 pounds Derek's stress and control had stripped from her frame. Her hair, no longer subjected to the tight, severe styles Derek preferred, fell in natural waves around her shoulders. But the most dramatic change was in her eyes. The constant vigilance and fear had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like hope. "You're going to be amazing," Rachel called from the kitchen, where she was making coffee before heading to her job at the regional medical center. "Patterson and Associates would be crazy not to hire you back." The irony wasn't lost on Camila that she was interviewing for a position at her former company. The job Derek had convinced her was meaningless and beneath her abilities. Her former supervisor, Janet, had been shocked to receive her call 3 weeks ago, explaining that she was ready to return to work and asking if there might be any opportunities available. "We never found anyone who could match your client management skills," Janet had told her during their preliminary phone conversation. "Several of our major accounts have been asking when you might come back." The knowledge that she had been valued and missed gave Camila a confidence she hadn't felt in years. Derek's constant criticism and belittling had convinced her that she was incompetent and unemployable, but the reality was that she had been good at her job, very good, and people remembered that. Living with Rachel had been a gradual process of rediscovering herself. The first month had been the hardest, filled with panic attacks when the phone rang, nightmares about Derek finding her, and a constant state of hypervigilance that made normal activities feel impossible. But Rachel, with her medical training and infinite patience, had helped Camila understand that her reactions were normal responses to trauma, not signs of weakness or instability. "Healing isn't linear," Rachel had explained during one of Camila's darker moments. "Some days you'll feel strong and confident, other days you'll feel like you're back at square one. That's normal. What matters is that you're safe now and you're choosing to heal." The legal proceedings had moved more quickly than anyone expected. Derek's initial rage at discovering Camila's escape had led him to make several crucial mistakes. He had called Rachel's house repeatedly, making threats and demands that were recorded and turned over to the police. He had showed up at Rachel's workplace, causing a scene that resulted in a restraining order. Most damaging of all, he had hired a private investigator to track Camila down, not realizing that such behavior would be seen as stalking by the courts. James and his friends had been true to their word, documenting everything and providing testimony that painted a clear picture of Derek's abusive behavior. The divorce had been finalized just last month, with Camila receiving a settlement that would allow her to rebuild her life on her own terms. "Derek tried to claim you were mentally unstable," the lawyer had explained. "But we had medical records, photographs, witness testimony, and his own emails proving a pattern of psychological abuse." The judge wasn't sympathetic to his arguments. Now, as Camila prepared for her interview, she reflected on how much her relationship with fear had changed. She was still nervous about returning to work, still worried about whether she could perform at the level she once had, but these were normal anxieties, not the paralyzing terror that had ruled her life with Derek. The interview went better than she had dared to hope. Janet and the other managers welcomed her back like a returning family member, and the accounts she had once managed were eager to work with her again. They offered her a position as senior marketing coordinator, with a salary higher than what she had earned when she left. "We learned how valuable you were when we tried to replace you," Janet said with a smile. "Consider this our way of making sure you don't leave again." That afternoon, Camila called James to share the good news. He had been her anchor throughout the past 6 months, checking in regularly and providing both practical support and emotional encouragement. "I'm proud of you," he said, and she could hear the genuine warmth in his voice. "It takes incredible strength to rebuild your life the way you have." "I couldn't have done it without you and your friends," Camila replied. "You saved my life." "No," James said firmly. "You saved your own life. We just helped you remember that you had the power to do it." As evening approached, Camila sat on Rachel's back porch, watching the sunset and thinking about the future. For the first time in years, she could make plans that extended beyond just surviving each day. She could think about finding her own apartment, about rebuilding friendships, about perhaps someday trusting someone enough to consider a romantic relationship built on respect and equality rather than control and fear. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and for a moment her old anxiety spiked. But the message was from Sarah, her former colleague, who had somehow gotten her number from Janet. "Heard you're coming back. Can't wait to catch up over drinks and hear about everything. Friday night? My treat." The invitation to normal social interaction, to friendship and laughter and the simple pleasure of being around people who liked her for who she was, brought tears to Camila's eyes. These were good tears, tears of gratitude and anticipation rather than fear and despair. She texted back immediately, "I'd love that. See you Friday." As the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Derek would never again have the power to prevent her from enjoying, Camila felt something she had thought was lost forever: excitement about tomorrow. Not just relief that she had survived today, but genuine enthusiasm for what the future might hold. She was no longer Derek's victim. She was Camila, a strong, intelligent, capable woman who had survived something terrible and emerged with her spirit intact. And that was something worth celebrating. 1 year after her escape, Camila sat in the front row of a courthouse in her best professional suit, watching as Derek was led to the defendant's table in handcuffs. The man who had once controlled every aspect of her life now looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the weight of the charges against him. The criminal trial had taken months to prepare, but the prosecution had built an overwhelming case. Derek faced charges of domestic violence, stalking, harassment. Retry. CC. Continue. Edit. And violation of the restraining order. The evidence James and his friends had gathered, combined with Camila's detailed testimony and the testimonies of multiple witnesses, painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. The defendant's behavior represents a textbook case of domestic abuse, the prosecutor had explained during opening statements. He isolated the victim from her support system, controlled her finances, and used physical and psychological violence to maintain dominance over her. This is not a case of marital discord, this is a case of criminal behavior. Camila had dreaded testifying, but when her moment came, she found strength she didn't know she possessed. Standing at the witness stand, looking directly at Derek for the first time since her escape, she felt no fear. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so capable of destroying her, was just a bitter, controlling person who had built his sense of worth on making someone else feel worthless. He told me I was nothing without him, she testified, her voice clear and steady. He convinced me that no one else would ever want me, that I was lucky he was willing to put up with my flaws. But I realize now that he was describing himself. He was nothing without someone to control and diminish. Derek's lawyer had tried to paint Camila as vindictive and unstable, claiming she had fabricated the abuse allegations to gain advantage in the divorce proceedings. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear, the witnesses too credible. James testified about what he had observed during his visit, describing Derek's obvious need to dominate and control the conversation, and Camila's visible fear and physical injuries. Sergeant Johnson and Corporal Washington corroborated his testimony, adding their professional observations about the dynamics they had witnessed. In our military training, we learned to recognize signs of abuse and domestic violence, Sergeant Johnson testified. What we saw in that house was a classic case of an abuser using intimidation and psychological manipulation to control his victim. The most damaging testimony came from Derek's former colleagues, who reluctantly admitted under oath that Derek had often made disturbing comments about his marriage and his wife. His secretary testified that she had heard him on the phone with Camila, speaking to her with a level of disrespect and cruelty that had made her uncomfortable. He would call her stupid, worthless, incompetent, she testified. He talked about her like she was his property rather than his wife. It made everyone in the office uncomfortable, but he was a partner, so no one felt they could say anything. Derek's own behavior during the trial worked against him. When he took the stand in his own defense, his arrogance and lack of remorse were obvious to everyone in the courtroom. He refused to take responsibility for any of his actions, instead blaming Camila for provoking him and claiming that his behavior was normal for any man dealing with a difficult wife. I provided for her, gave her everything she needed, Derek testified, his voice rising with indignation. She lived in a beautiful house, never had to work, never had to worry about money. And this is how she repays me, by making up lies and destroying my reputation. The prosecutor's cross-examination was devastating. Mr. Hamilton, when you say you gave your wife everything she needed, did that include the right to have friends? She could have friends if she chose appropriate ones. Did it include the right to work outside the home? She didn't need to work. I provided everything. Did it include the right to speak to her own family? Her family was toxic and interfering. Did it include the right to express disagreement with your decisions? Derek's pause was telling. Marriage requires someone to lead and someone to follow. And did it include the right to be safe from physical violence in her own home? I never seriously heard her. Sometimes people argue, sometimes voices are raised, sometimes dash. Mr. Hamilton, are you saying it's acceptable for a husband to hit his wife? The question hung in the air like a trap, and Derek walked right into it. I'm saying that what happens between a husband and wife is private, and outsiders don't understand the full context. The courtroom was silent as Derek essentially admitted that he believed he had the right to use violence against his wife. Even his own lawyer looked horrified. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict with clear conviction, guilty on all counts. Derek's face went white as the judge announced his sentence. 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation during which he would be prohibited from contacting Camila or any member of her family. He was also ordered to attend anger management and domestic violence counseling, and to pay restitution for Camila's medical expenses and counseling costs. As Derek was led away in handcuffs, he turned to look at Camila one last time. But instead of the fear and submission he was used to seeing in her eyes, he saw something that must have shaken him to his core: pity. She felt sorry for him, for the empty, broken person he had become, but she was no longer afraid of him. Outside the courthouse, James and his friends were waiting with Rachel and several of Camila's co-workers who had come to support her. The group celebrated quietly, understanding that while justice had been served, this had been a difficult and painful process for everyone involved. "How do you feel?" Rachel asked as they walked toward their cars. Camila considered the question carefully. "Free," she said finally. "Completely, finally free." 6 months later, Camila moved into her own apartment, a bright one-bedroom place with large windows and no memories of fear or violence. She had been promoted again at work and was managing some of the company's most important accounts. She had reconnected with old friends and made new ones, building a social life based on mutual respect and genuine affection. She had also started volunteering at a local domestic violence shelter, sharing her story with other women who were struggling to escape abusive relationships. Her experience with Derek, as terrible as it had been, had given her unique insights into the psychology of abuse and the process of healing that helped her connect with other survivors. "The hardest part," she would tell the women she counseled, "is believing you deserve better. The abuse convinces you that you're worthless, that no one else would want you, that you're lucky someone is willing to put up with you. But those are lies. You are valuable, you are worthy of love and respect, and you have the strength to build a better life." One evening, as she sat in her apartment reading a book she had chosen simply because it interested her, Camila's phone rang. The caller ID showed James's number, and she answered with a smile. "How's civilian life treating you?" she asked. James and his friends had recently completed their military service and were transitioning to civilian careers. "Can't complain," James replied. "I actually called because I wanted to tell you something. Derek was denied parole last week. He won't be eligible to apply again for another year." Camila absorbed this information with surprising calm. A year ago, news about Derek would have sent her into a panic. Now, it was simply information about someone who was no longer part of her life. "How do you feel about that?" James asked. "Relieved for any woman who might have encountered him if he'd been released," Camila said honestly. "But mostly, I don't feel anything about Derek anymore. He's just someone I used to know, someone who taught me important lessons about strength and resilience, though I'm sure that wasn't his intention." After hanging up, Camila returned to her book, a mystery novel about a detective who specialized in solving cold cases. It was exactly the kind of book Derek would have dismissed as frivolous and worthless, which made reading it feel like a small but significant act of rebellion. As she turned the pages in her bright, peaceful apartment, surrounded by plants she had chosen and furniture that reflected her own taste, Camila reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The abuse had been real, the fear had been overwhelming, and the process of healing had been harder than anything she had ever done. But she had survived. More than that, she had thrived. She had reclaimed her life, her identity, and her future. She had learned that she was stronger than she ever imagined, braver than she ever believed, and worthy of the love and respect she had thought were lost forever. Derek had tried to destroy her, but instead, he had inadvertently shown her just how unbreakable she really was. And for that, in a strange way, she was almost grateful. The woman who had once cowered in fear at the sound of footsteps was gone. In her place was someone who knew her own worth, who would never again allow someone to diminish her light, who understood that true strength came not from controlling others but from choosing to build rather than destroy. Camila smiled as she turned another page, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, she would face them with courage, wisdom, and the unshakable conviction that she deserved nothing less than a life filled with respect, dignity, and joy. Justice had been served, but more importantly, she had served justice to herself by refusing to remain a victim and choosing instead to become a survivor, a thriver, and ultimately, a victor in the battle for her own life.